Hello. A little while ago I did a few videos exploring on a kind of surface level ideas about the origin of language and how language might have come about, what it might be for on an adaptational level. And one thing that I kind of glossed over or didn't explore very much in that small series of videos was the neurological side of things, because I don't understand neurology. I'm not a neurologist, and I wouldn't know where to look for that kind of literature, and I also wouldn't understand it if I tried to read it. So this video is a conversation with Cypranowska, who has a PhD in molecular and cell biology from the Isakov lab at UC Berkeley. At the moment she studies how neurons adapt to different environmental demands, ultimately to shed light on how the nervous system evolved. And so she is in a good position to decode some of this literature, and I really appreciate the work she's put into sourcing papers and making them accessible here. The first thing I'll do is a very brief explanation of how syntacticians tend to think about sentence structure. And this may be contrasted later with neurological perspectives on how the brain processes this kind of thing. I'll put a time on screen if you already know about this and want to skip over it, but sentences are seen as having a nested structure. They break down into phrases like noun phrases and verb phrases, and these phrases kind of fit into each other a bit like one of those Russian dolls. And this structure is represented using syntax trees. So in a sentence like "the dog took the ball," at the highest level this is one sentence. At a slightly lower level this is a noun phrase, "the dog," followed by a verb phrase, "took the ball." The noun phrase breaks down into a determiner, "the," and a noun, "dog." And then the verb phrase breaks down into a verb, "took," and then another noun phrase, "the ball." And then this noun phrase, "the ball," breaks down into a determiner, "the," and a noun, "ball." So with straightforward sentences like this, it's sort of phrases stacked within phrases, stacked within phrases. Some of Noam Chomsky's suggestions about linguistic universals rely on this way of thinking about syntax, but they might not quite be in line with how the brain actually processes sentences, and this might be relevant later in the video. Here's a little content slide in case you want to refer back to anything specific. Apologies for the times in the conversation that I don't seem to know what I'm talking about. The chances are it's because I don't. And here it is, and thanks very much again to Caroline for her time and effort here.
I guess one of the biggest challenges was trying to figure out how words and operations that act on words are represented in the brain is because the way that linguists understand sentences and the way that neuroscientists understand how speech is processed are totally different. In linguistics, sort of like the objects that you work with are things like phonemes, words, phrases, and the operations that act on those objects. And examples of those things are like concatenations or merging. And that is totally separate from like the basic things that neuroscientists observe when we study speech. We are interested in neurons and the connections between them, groups of neurons that form circuits that mediate various processes in the brain. And the operations that perform on those objects, like things like oscillations of activity, different forms of plasticity, which is basically a sort of catch-all term for processes that allow the connections between neurons to increase or decrease their strength depending on how they're used. And adaptation and things like that. So trying to form a bridge between sort of like the basic units of discussion and for linguists and the way that they understand language versus neuroscientists and the way that they understand language, it's a huge chasm to try to cross.
I've read things about universal grammar and criticisms of universal grammar. One of the things I have noticed is that sort of people say things like the way things are actually realized cognitively, if that's the right way of wording it, doesn't actually accord to how, how syntax trees, for example, would kind of categorize them.
I guess as far as universal grammar goes and the way that words are represented in the brain, we have, well, sometimes people make certain assumptions about the extent to which things in the brain are compartmentalized. because we notice particular features in language, like the fact that nouns and verbs seem to be a prototypical way of representing objects versus actions, that there must be somewhere in our brain a space where all the nouns live and a space where all the verbs live.
That's how I would imagine it.
Various like ways of operating on them that represent like the process of producing speech or comprehending speech. So within like neurolinguistics and cognitive science, science and psychology related fields, there are a couple of different models for how words and language is represented in the brain. And each of these views in its like purest form is fairly extreme and to the point where it's probably not realistically true, but they provide interesting frameworks for how we think about how language might be operating in the brain. So one of these is a lexicalist view, which is the idea that grammatical class is the main driver of how words are represented in the brain, and that information pertaining to grammatical class is retrieved from memory during speech production or speech comprehension. And there are some neuroimaging and other types of studies that support this idea that there's a particular localization to locations in the brain where semantic and syntactic processes are separable. And this is also supported by the fact that grammatical class is usually preserved when people make errors in speech. So as I mentioned earlier, when there are lexical errors in speech, you're usually swapping a noun for a different noun, saying dog instead of cat, using an incorrect verb, and also the fact that verbs tend to have present a greater tax on the brain during speech. There are lots of highly inflected languages out there where you have to choose the right verb based on the tense, whether or not it's an imperfective or perfective verb. Looking at the number of subjects that are in the sentence that are performing the verb and may determine which conjugation you end up choosing when you are constructing or composing a sentence. And verbs tend to just be more complicated in general, where there are larger number of players that are involved in the verb. They sort of project meaning onto other words, whereas nouns don't necessarily always do that. And because of this sort of like these different bodies of information, some people have viewed grammatical class as an important way of separating words and their representations in the brain. There's also a sort of emergentist view, which is a grammatical class kind of emerges from semantic constraints. Prototypical nouns usually refer to objects, prototypical verbs usually refer to actions, but based on how we expect certain words to appear in a sentence and things like that, phonological regularities, we find that this emergentist view argues that grammatical class arises out of those things. It's not necessarily something that is hard-coded in the brain, but is a result of the processes that happen to these words. And there's sort of this intermediate view, also called the combinatorial view, which is grammatical class is not necessarily lexically specified, but it's part of an integration process that is invoked when you're parsing or producing sentences, but not necessarily when you're listening to a list of words. It only gets engaged when it actually is needed. Meaning does not necessarily distinguish between lexical categories here. Nouns, verbs, and adjectives can express similar meanings, but the main differences between them are syntactic and morphological, and that occurs as a consequence of trying to arrange words into a sentence.
One example you gave was
I think this links in with one of the papers, maybe the Vigliocco one. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the idea that while you have, I'm just checking this is the right paper, while you have sort of concrete nouns and verbs which seem to be neurally represented fairly separately, you then have words which are kind of not categorizable in the same way because their semantic fields are so kind of nebulous. I think you used the example of murder, which I think you might have read you might have got from somewhere else. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So one of the big challenges with trying to, like, for example, record fMRI signals or electrical activity in the brain as a result of parsing speech is the extent to which we make the context of the words naturalistic. So in the sort of, well, I mean, this is still something that's ongoing, but in the past, we often would just use things like lists of words to try to understand how the brain interprets speech. But the thing is, there's a lot of variety in the words that we use and the things that they represent, like concrete nouns, sort of concrete verbs versus abstract nouns and abstract verbs make up a huge part of language, and sort of presenting stimuli that are basically lists of words to somebody who is listening might not be actually representative of anything that is related to human speech. So while breaking down words into like sort of these list-like objects is important for understanding sort of the granular mechanics of how the brain interprets speech, it also, you know, doesn't necessarily relate to anything that we do in real life in terms of speech. So having context and having naturalism makes our jobs harder as neuroscientists to understand the data, but it also is part of the more important, interesting stuff. And sort of disentangling semantics in the design of these experiments from lexical class is a huge challenge. And I think the existence of these abstract nouns and verbs are sort of a testament to that. There have been over the years a number of various clever ways where people have done either neuroimaging experiments like fMRI, or they do EEG recordings, so measuring the electrical response of different parts of the brain from outside. Oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought there.
That's all right.
So people have tried various ways of divorcing semantics from lexical class or grammatical class, right. And it's been a huge challenge. There was one interesting paper that was cited in the review that we had posted, where the experimenters invented a bunch of pseudo words and then placed them in contexts where they could be interpreted as either a noun, like they put an article like the in front of it, sure. Or they put it in the context of a verb by putting the word to in front of it. And while that's an interesting way of trying to remove semantics from the equation, because if it's a made-up word, then it shouldn't necessarily have any predefined associations, we don't actually know if that's true. The pseudo word may sound like an object that you're familiar with if you put the in front of it, and maybe when somebody hears that word, they try to sort of break it down. Does it sound like something I already know? Is there any kind of morphological feature of that word that can give me some kind of preconceived idea about what it means that might contaminate a result like that? I think other sort of examples that people have tried to some different strategies that people have tried to use to divorce semantics from grammatical class when looking for how the brain processes speech is, let's see. So sometimes they would control for semantics using only abstract nouns and abstract verbs. The example of like murder, color, love are all great words that demonstrate this particular feature, because for example, the action to color something versus color the noun are semantically very, very close to each other. So same with things like murder. It has a legal concept that is associated with it, but it's also an action. And so those two meanings are so deeply intertwined that perhaps that can serve as a control for semantics. And other things that I think people have observed that maybe provide some ideas about why nouns and verbs maybe have compartmentalized representations in the brain are the fact that verb impairments seem to be more common.
In terms of impairment and being able to process verbs, or
in people who have various types of aphasias, or even in the context of neurodegenerative disorders and things like that, and neurodevelopmental disorders. So there's some evidence that that at least the different operations or representations may be partially separable, but the question is, to what extent are they? Is that the case?
Right. Mm-hmm. Wasn't there something about sort of morphosyntactic complexity having some effect on representation as well? So like
so that's mostly involved in like verb processing. So one of the ideas about why verbs might have like verbs seem to be the locus of lots of these different speech disorders is because the degree to which they need to be processed, especially in highly inflected languages, is much greater. So the idea would be then that there are more points of failure upon which you could end up having verbs being impaired, like incorrect agreement, like you chose the wrong conjugation, so on and so forth. And so that would be involved like in morphosyntactic processing, basically. Being able to select the right case and tense, the correct tense of a verb when constructing or interpreting a sentence.
But then that's largely just the morphosyntactic complexity. And if you were to take a noun that was complex, or if you were to go into a language where nouns are morphosyntactically complex kind of by default, then you'd probably see a more leveled version of that, do you think?
Potentially, yes. Although, like, I'm not sure that there exists a language where somebody has actually gone out and tested that to see if, for example, if you have a language where nouns get declined in many, many more ways than any verb would you see more impairments in noun processing? Totally possible, but I don't know if that's necessarily been the case.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can think of a language where that's the case.
But I guess as far as like evidence goes to support the claim that words, that there's like a noun space in the brain and a verb space in the brain, have been related to the fact that verbs are more difficult to process. When we look at these different language impairments, they seem to be much more common.
Should we hop onto the Moseley paper? Or is there more to say about? Hang on, trying to see what I've written about it. So it's the fMRI.
Basically, the idea with the Moseley paper is that semantics are very hard to control for when looking at how the brain responds to certain things. When people, for example, make particular grammatical errors, like they insert the wrong word into a sentence, usually things like grammatical class are preserved. Like you say the word cat when you really meant to say the word dog in a particular sentence. Although this may look at first like evidence that there are the operations that act on nouns versus the operations that act on verbs when interpreting speech in the brain are separable by a grammatical class, you can't entirely disentangle semantics here, because if, for example, you imagine some kind of semantic map of the brain and there's a location where there's a neural representation of what the concept of a cat is, perhaps all the things in the neighborhood semantically of what the cat is are also concrete nouns.
Yeah.
So being able to control for semantics has been like the greatest challenge of the field. So what this paper by Moseley and Pulvermuller tried to achieve was by looking at the interaction between semantics and lexical class to see if there are actually interactions between those two features of words and whether or not those things better map onto recorded brain activity when somebody is listening to speech. And they found that basically what they did is they selected these lexically unambiguous nouns and verbs for their fMRI recording and controlled for lots of other features of the words, things like word length, the number of bigrams or trigrams, the frequency of the words. And they found that distinct patterns showed up in the brain activity when you have concrete and abstract factors interacting with noun and verb factors. So looking at their fMRI data, concrete nouns and concrete verbs provided the most different signal in the brain. So they elicited the most distinct responses for the two. But lexical class, if you looked across all of the nouns and verbs that they chose, didn't produce anything that was statistically significant, which basically means that the recorded signal from the brain when listening to either of those categories of words was something that you couldn't necessarily separate from the other category. Like if you looked at the brain activity, would you be able to tell if that person had just listened to a noun or a verb? If it was a concrete noun and a concrete verb, then you probably would be able to tell. But if those verbs and nouns occupied a more abstract space where the semantics are closer, then it becomes much more difficult. And it's only when these two factors interact can you actually be able to disambiguate lexical class from things like semantics.
I don't think this was part of their research, but it was a reference to something else. It said that there are sort of, even within concrete nouns and within concrete verbs, there are kind of topographical differences in representation. If, like, so for example, if you're talking about concrete verbs related to something you're doing with your arm versus something you're doing with your leg are going to be mapped in slightly different places. So that's, I suppose, evidence that even though semantically concrete verbs are going to cluster together just because of what they are, it's still a semantic thing rather than a these are verbs, so they go in the verb box kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the idea that they were trying to get at with there was that even within like a grammatical class, you can have dissociations. Like, for example, the face, arm, and leg related verbs also like are sort of tied within the nouns that they sort of reference.
Okay.
As far as looking at universal grammar and trying to find features in language that are sort of ubiquitous across all, like basically ubiquitous across what we know about human speech, one can look at similarities in the structure of sentences, which is what linguists do. But from a neuroscientist perspective, what we try to do is look for representations in the brain. And a representation is essentially some kind of recorded activity that is a result of a particular environmental stimulus being presented to us. So in visual systems, this would be an image. In auditory systems, this would be sound. But when we're talking about how language is processed, it would be changes of activity in the brain that are specific to the thing being presented, like a particular morpheme or phoneme, a word, your sort of concept of what that word might mean in your brain, and things like that. And this has been a pretty big challenge as far as neuroscience goes, but there have been some kind of interesting studies from David Popel's lab at NYU looking at things like timing being important in how the brain processes speech, and most human languages need to conform to those limitations of the human brain to be able to communicate. And so they did some interesting experiments in Mandarin, where basically they played single syllable words at a defined frequency at a very specific interval. And I believe what they chose was 4 hertz. And then they assembled them into hierarchical structures. So the first 2 syllables, which represent individual words, were put into a noun phrase, and I believe the second 2 were put into a verb phrase, and in combination, those things made up a sentence. And when native Mandarin speakers listened to these sentences, there were some interesting patterns in the activity that they recorded. For example, they saw a spike in particular in activity at 4 hertz, which was the frequency at which they played the syllables or words. So 4 of them were occurring per second. They saw another spike at 2 hertz, which would correspond to those words being assembled into phrases. So if you have a 4-word sentence that consists of a verb phrase and a noun phrase, then we'd expect those phrasal information to be arriving at half the frequency of the syllables. And then finally, if those two phrases are assembled into one sentence, then you'd expect 1 sentence per second. And they also see that same spike at 1 hertz, the 1 sentence per second. Which is kind of interesting. It basically says that the brain has multiple different processes that help assemble information in sort of a nested way, where our brain is interpreting syllable-related information at one time scale, and that's being integrated into a larger process where phrasal information is being integrated, and that is occurring over a slower time period. And then even slower than that are things like sentential information. And to control for this, they also did things like where they just played a list of words at 4 hertz. So basically you're listening to a shopping list, like a grocery list or some kind of list of objects that's being played at very defined intervals. And what they see in the data is that slower frequency activity, the 1 hertz for sentential information, the 2 hertz for phrasal information, that goes away. You only have the syllabic related processing that is occurring at the higher frequency, the faster frequency. They also redid the experiment where they just had 2-word phrases, but were not assembled into a sentence. So I believe they just chose 2-word verb phrases that they just played out and had listeners sit and they monitored their activity. And basically what they found is that they still had that 4 hertz signal that corresponds to the rate at which the syllables are being interpreted, but they also still had that 2 hertz phrasal information, but not the very slow 1 hertz sentential related activity. So it's clear that like the brain is able to build up these operations in a way that is not entirely separable from each other. It's sort of a bit like a hierarchical process. And interestingly enough, they did this experiment where they had English speakers listen to the list of nouns that they played for the Mandarin speakers. or no, they played out the full sentences. So four-word sentences arranged into the two-word noun phrase, two-word verb phrase. And if you don't understand a particular language, you can still break down the syllables between like in the actual like audio profile of the speech that's being played. But you can't assemble those syllables into the noun phrases and verb phrases, so none of that 2 Hertz signal. And you can't assemble those phrases into the sentence, which is the 1 Hertz signal. So English speakers listening to the Mandarin materials that were prepared, you only get the 4 Hertz spike.
Syllables are a more kind of concrete sonority related thing, aren't they? Where generally it's vowels broken apart by consonants, which are less sonorous than the vowels, so you can pretty much hear. It's more of a concrete, objective thing rather than something you need, semantic information to modify.
And the crazy thing is, like, one of the reasons why they chose 4 Hertz at which to play the single syllable words is because sort of those stop signals that you would see in the audio profile of a particular syllable across languages on average are about 4 Hertz. So your brain is kind of tuned to that particular rate of speech.
So that's like a common standard rate of speech across linguistically.
I mean, it does. There's a lot of spread, but the average is it kind of averages out to about 4 Hertz per syllable across languages.
And when they changed the lengths of the phrases, it kind of the phrasal processing tuned into the changed.
Yeah, so they didn't do that in particular in this paper. Part of the reason why they wanted to be able to control the length of the phrases and also control the number of syllables in each word is so that when they look at the recordings, the MEG recordings, they can actually associate the change in activity with the stimulus being provided. So if you look at the English speaker figures for these particular papers, it's much harder to construct sentences that have 4 syllables, 4 words in the English language. And so there is a little bit of blurriness there, a little bit of noise introduced by the fact that when constructing a sentence like that, you sometimes need to have more than 1 syllable in your word. Yeah, I think one of the reasons why the experimenters chose Mandarin is because for the initial sort of figures in the paper is because it's very easy to control for something like that, and just removes noise from the data. But yeah, so the idea though is that you have a basic operation of being able to parse syllables, a sort of higher order process where you're able to put those syllables into phrases and then finally assemble those phrases into sentences. And that occurs in sort of a hierarchical fashion where you can't necessarily assemble the sentences without doing the operations on the phrases and the syllables. So as far as universal grammar goes then what you'd expect perhaps to be a consistent feature across languages is not necessarily things like grammatical class, but things like being able to conform to this particular type of timing and these hierarchical operations. So perhaps that is a thing that is the more universal feature across languages. As opposed to the existence of nouns and verbs.
It's interesting that it
represented as like these compartmentalized things in the brain. Yeah.
It's interesting that it kind of jumps from the syllabic level to the phrasal level without kind of going past a morpheme or a word kind of level.
Yeah, so the tricky thing about words is at least when looking at sort of the audio signal of speech that is provided in these types of MEG or fMRI experiments, the sort of basically it's easy for the brain to pick out the ends of syllables, it's much harder for brains to pick out complete words when looking at an audio signal. I know that sounds like it would be kind of strange, but there's no like real stop signal, and there's no pre-labeling of like what those sounds would mean, like a noun or a verb. And because speech is a continuous waveform without these stop signals, your brain has to parse speech into words. But the syllable thing, it occurs like without even you necessarily being able to understand the language. So that's syllables end up being like the sort of the particulate atomic basic unit for parsing, as opposed to words. Yeah, that speech envelope, the sort of, if you were to take an audio recording and sort of make a waveform around that audio signal, that speech envelope has really good boundaries between syllables, but words and phrases, not so much. Your brain has to do a lot more work to be able to interpret that. So yeah, that's kind of where that's one of the reasons why they skipped over the word things and they just went straight to syllables.
Yeah, yeah. It might not be completely relevant to this, but the divisions between words aren't always obvious, even to native speakers of languages. That, for example, I mean, we can easily break down words, or we can break down phrases into words because, well, probably partly because we write language and partly because of the way we're taught it. But for a speaker of a language that doesn't have a written tradition, it might be a lot harder to kind of work out where word boundaries are, because, as you said, speech is just a continuous flowing thing. And even within sort of older texts of languages that don't have standardized writing systems, although there'll always be kind of tradition. If there's a written tradition, there'll always be some kind of vague pseudo standard because people have learned from other people. But in Old English, for example, to use to drag Old English into it temporarily, there's a prefix y which is added to the start of past participle nouns, and that's cognate with g in German, as in gesungen and things like that. And in some texts that's written as part of the word, and in some texts it's separated off from it. So even speakers of that language with that written tradition couldn't necessarily tell if something was an inflection or if it was a separate enclitic thing or something like that. So maybe words aren't really as much of a
discrete entity.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, orthography probably plays a much bigger role in that than maybe like we would initially appreciate, because the boundary, the boundaries between words is in part enforced by the way that we're taught to write them as like discrete entities. So
yeah, okay.
That's another reason why to skip over the word thing and go straight from syllables to phrasal information.
I wonder if, obviously this isn't something we've looked at, but I just as a random thought for people to dwell on, I wonder if there's such thing as a completely, I suppose there are speakers of English who can't, I know some people who can't really read, but if you compared the neural representation of something like the phrase the dog in someone who can't read versus someone who can read, whether there'd be a difference, because the dog could be interpreted as a word with an inflection, or it could be interpreted as two separate words. But that's just a random thought for people to sort of dwell on.
I wonder, well, so Fatma Denise's paper, she was a graduate student in Jack Gallant's lab. She looked at semantic representation of different like things in the brain, things like the dog or various social verbs and all different kinds of things in the brain, comparing speech. So when you hear a particular phrase, like what kind of patterns of activity are elicited in the brain versus reading the same materials, and they map onto each other quite well. So if we take that to be sort of our, ground truth there. Then in your hypothetical sort of situation where you have a speaker of a language who has a concept of what the dog is, but they don't necessarily know how to read that material, then the representation, at least semantically, would be the same in the brain. Without necessarily knowing how to write. That's what that particular paper would predict, just because they concluded that semantic representation in the brain is not necessarily a function of stimulus modality, which in this case would be listening to speech versus reading something that is written.
Okay. So if we pretend I haven't just spent 5 minutes trying to work out what the example sentence means, and jump from the working memory thing to grammaticality, jump from the timing thing to sort of working memory and grammaticality. There are two kind of concepts that are kind of tied into each other. So there's grammaticality, which is whether a sentence is technically grammatically correct, and then there's acceptability, which is whether a speaker kind of accepts it as correct. So a sentence can be technically grammatically correct, but can be unacceptable to a native speaker. So an example in Gibson and Thomas, which I've just spent ages looking for, is there's a grammatical but unacceptable sentence which they use: the patient who the nurse who the clinic had hired admitted met Jack. And I'll put a thing up on screen kind of passing that. But then if you take out the word admitted, so it's the patient who the nurse who the clinic had hired met Jack, that sounds more acceptable, even though when you actually examine it, it doesn't actually make any sense. So that's, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that has something to do with working memory. So you can only hold so many components in your head at the same time before something just becomes incomprehensible. So that's like a center embedding thing. So where you shove, you kind of.
Yeah, so one of the interesting implications of the Ding et al. Paper, especially with these hierarchical building operations, where you're sort of interpreting language at sort of on different time scales, well, your brain has to be able to hold all of those concepts in your working memory so that you can understand the relationships between the different words that are being spoken and you can interpret the sentence. So one interesting strategy to study how the brain parses speech is, instead of just playing out lists of words or normal sentences to somebody whose brain activity is being recorded, you can try to break a sentence essentially and see how their brain responds to something that seems ungrammatical, is incomprehensible, something that doesn't make sense. And when this type of thing happens in speech, especially when the error being made is a syntactical error, it elicits a response called the P600 response. And basically why it's called the P600 is that P stands for positivity, which basically means that in the recording of the EEG that you are making, that is the direction of the change in electrical signal. And it occurs roughly 600 milliseconds after the stimulus that was presented. So this P600 response often happens as is observed when syntactical errors are made. And interestingly enough, you can sort of recapitulate that effect when you present a sentence to somebody that is grammatical, but has either so many phrases embedded within each other that the relationships between the words become difficult to parse, or having these long garden path sentences, these long WH dependencies as well. So even though the sentence is technically correct, or you can basically elicit this error response. Something sounds wrong to the listener, and this is believed to be a consequence of working memory. basically, you can imagine this scenario, especially with the center embedding, where the verb that is being placed towards the very end of the sentence is actually referring to a subject at the very beginning.
Yeah.
If you add in a bunch of words in between there, then you begin to lose the relationship between the different objects in the sentence and the verbs that are acting, or that are projecting onto them. There's basically, there are a lot of different models for how this possibly works, but all we know is that for language to work, it must conform to sort of the brain's limitations in working memory, and being able to access long-term memory and assemble those concepts.
So something like the subjacency rule, let me know if this is like not really relevant discussion, but something like the subjacency rule, where you're kind of spreading a subject across two bounding nodes, and it becomes kind of unacceptable to a native speaker of, well, apparently any language, but most languages anyway. Would you say that might be a working memory thing as well, or is that beyond the scope of?
That would probably be something that would elicit a P600 response in a person. Whether or not that arises as a consequence of working memory is a whole other question that I'm not sure has actually been explored yet, although it would be an interesting thing to look at. These sort of long garden path sentences and WH dependencies certainly are a limitation of working memory, because when the sentences are written down, they're interpretable. We have more time as like a reader to be able to go over a sentence over again. But when we're listening to this type of speech in real time, and we also have to parse all the syllables, the phrases, and the sentences in real time, then that's where things become tricky. So the subjacency rule might not necessarily be a consequence of working memory, but would probably trigger similar error responses in the brain as the P600, because it is a syntactical mistake, essentially. You put this very well in your universal grammar video when you pose the question, if a language program exists, to what extent is it innate, and to what extent is it adaptive, and are there some aspects of grammar that are already built into the brain and the way that it operates. So this Popel lab view of this particular question would be the integration of units of speech over multiple time scales is sort of this pre-built biologically tuned aspect of grammar and the way that we interpret speech. The Gallant Lab has done an interesting study on semantic mapping of different words, different concepts on the brain using fMRI. And basically what they did in this experiment is that they had several subjects listen to a storytelling podcast called The Moth. Oh. And they recorded the brain activity using fMRI, and they were able to generate a predictive model for how the brain would respond to a word in a particular semantic category. And they found that there are areas that are selective for certain like semantic categories, for example, concrete versus abstract words, action verbs, words pertaining to social narratives, and that across an individual, these activations were pretty similar. But the bigger question, particularly when we're asking about pre-built aspects of grammar in the brain, we'd also want to say, like, how consistent is this across individuals? So what they found is that semantic information is distributed all across the brain, not just in like Broca's area or things that we sort of associate with language processing in general. About a third of the activity that they see, these specific patterns, are shared across individuals, and about 2/3 of it is varies. And this is presumably due to the fact that we have different experiences in life, and that experience drives some of this variation that we see between individuals. So therefore, like sort of, there's some degree of semantic overlap, or quite a bit of semantic overlap between individuals, but there's also room for variation. So some of it is definitely not pre-built in and is constructed as a result of our life experiences, our experience with language, listening to sentences and constructing them, and whatnot. And they don't necessarily correspond super well to linguistic primitives of grammatical class like noun and verb, but they correspond better to things like semantics. That was a particularly interesting paper, because one might also then follow up with, well, do these semantic representations stay stable when you're listening to somebody speak versus somebody read? And they actually did experiments where they followed up on this, and they found that the semantic representation is actually similar depending on whether or not the speech is listened to or text is read, which is interesting. And I think if they could extend it to bilingual speakers, that would be a really interesting way of sort of addressing variation in semantic representation between individuals. If some of it is driven by experience, and perhaps you speak two languages and therefore have two slightly different but highly overlapping concepts for the same thing, to what extent would they map onto each other, and to what extent would they differ from each other in a single individual?
That is interesting, because it's I think maybe it would surprise us how much people's kind of the lexical fields people have associated with particular words differ from person to person within a language or within a culture.
Another interesting finding from the Ding et al. Paper is that when they looked at sort of these different oscillations corresponding to parsing syllabic information versus phrasal information and sentential information, they found that there was some amount of spatial segregation between those different processes. So the first set of experiments they did used MEG recordings, which is a non-invasive way of recording brain activity. But they also performed similar experiments on people who were undergoing brain surgery for treating epilepsy, because all of these surgeries occur when the patient is cognizant and awake and aware and lucid of what's going on. It's often a good opportunity for people to place an electrode directly onto the brain and get some more granular detail about what sort of regions of the brain are undergoing different patterns of activity when presented with these types of stimuli. And what they found is that some of the electrodes were more or less specific for certain operations within these three categories. Some electrodes were specific for phrasal and sentential information. Some of them were more selected for syllabic information. So there does appear to be at least some amount of spatial segregation between these processes, but the extent to which that is built in is still kind of an open question.
Right. So segueing on, there's this particular gene, FOXP2, which is mentioned a lot of kind of pop anthropology papers or articles and things like that in connection to Neanderthals. So I think there's a study which I can't remember, but I'll reference it on screen, suggesting that Neanderthals have a similar, or had a similar version of this gene to humans, and that it might in some way be related to language capability. and I didn't have any idea what that really was. I think I had a vague idea that the connection to language was based on the fact that if people have a weird variant of the FOXP2 gene, then it can cause difficulties in language, although I hadn't read any of those papers, and I didn't know where to look for them. So thank you very much for them. But should we go into more detail about FOXP2 and what problems it actually causes if there's something different about it?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we have to consider when thinking about the development of language is that we can't necessarily divorce it entirely from biology. We, everything we experience in the world is filtered through our brains, and our brains are ultimately biological substance. So the development of language as being something that is an attribute of modern humans, we also have to consider biology when thinking about those things. And FOXP2 is an example of a gene that, when there are specific mutations in the gene, in humans have produced different types of speech impairments. I believe there's usually issues with selecting verb tense correctly. And that was one of the first things that I think were noticed in this family of individuals who have this very specific type of speech impairment. However, because lots of different parts of the brain are involved in processing language, and similarly, those regions are important for doing other things, mutating FOXP2 doesn't just produce issues with language, it also has the potential to affect a number of different systems in the brain. And some of those involve things like orofacial praxis, which is the process of executing speech, coordinating all the muscles in your mouth to be able to produce that. And there's also cognitive impairments that occur as a result of this FOXP2 mutation. So there are some individuals out there who believe that language evolved primarily as a means of organizing internal thought. And I think what this mutation in FOXP2 may be evidence or suggestive of, it's far from being definitive proof, is that the process of organizing internal thought, speech, and being able to produce speech are highly intertwined with each other. Just making this single amino acid substitution in one gene affects all of those systems, and not necessarily just whether or not you chose the correct verb conjugation to insert into this particular sentence. So FOXP2 is an interesting target to also consider when thinking about the potential language capabilities of ancient hominins, because their variants of the FOXP2 gene are so similar to ours. Is it possible that they could have had similar language capacities as modern humans? And there have been some interesting stem cell engineering papers where they try to Neanderthalize a line of stem cells and see what different genes are turned on or off differently in those cells. And they find that like genes like FOXP2 or things involved in lateralization, genes involved in laryngeal development are ones that seem to be differentially express. So making even a small subtle change in the gene, which, I mean, in the case of the KE family, which is the one with this rare mutation in FOXP2, that's a fairly extreme change in the protein. Even small subtle changes, though, like the difference between the Neanderthal variant of FOXP2 and the modern human, can actually affect many, many more things than just language. And there have been a lot of interesting molecular biology studies in mice that have shown this on a more granular scale, like at the level of individual neurons. So there was a paper a while back that was published where they take the mouse version of FOXP2. And FOXP2, because it is a gene that controls how other genes are used by a cell, it is very, very deeply conserved biologically. So mice have their own version of the FOXP2 gene, birds have their own version of the FOXP2 gene, and I believe when mutated, that actually affects bird song. And even invertebrates like fruit flies, which are the model organism that I study, they have a single FOXP gene. So it's not 1 and 2, but just FOXP. But, you know, even an invertebrate that has a totally different body plan, a totally different brain structure, has this gene. So when this paper in mice studying the sort of the effects of FOXP2 at sort of the neural level, at the behavioral level as well, they found that when you take the mouse version of the FOXP2 gene and introduce mutations that make it resemble the human version a bit more, you find differences in ultrasonic vocalizations in mice, which I believe the initial studies found that they were still able to produce it, but further investigations have found that there's differences in certain motifs, their frequency and timing in mouse vocalizations as a result of these types of mutations. They also found that even just the shape of the neurons of the mice that have this particular mutation have changed, like they form longer projections, different types of subcellular structures called dendrites, which are important for communication between neurons. Those get changed. And they also engage different mechanisms of plasticity differently. So if you introduce a humanizing FOXP2 mutation into the mouse version of the gene, and then look at how the neurons respond to a battery of different signaling conditions firing differently, you find that they modify their synapses in a way that's different than the regular version of the mouse FOXP2 gene. So even just making some of these mutations can have a quite diverse array of effects, and not just some things that are pertaining to the ultimate behavior, one of the ultimate behaviors that we study, which is the production of language, or the mouse version, which is not necessarily the best analogy. These ultrasonic vocalizations are not a thing that is learned, whereas language is. So it's not the best comparison, but that is affected, but also things like how well the neurons respond to changes in the environment. Can they increase or decrease the strength of their synapses, those connections between the neurons as well?
So with the vocalization thing, do you think that would be a laryngeal difference rather than something to do with the neural representation of how they actually, you know, like would it be?
I think it's possible for both of those things to be true, particularly with the evidence coming from the human studies of the KE family, and also some of these stem cell engineering papers that I've also referenced here.
They're like mechanical.
I don't think I'm not sure that they investigated it directly, but I have the paper in a tab. So they did some retrograde labeling.
What does that mean?
So basically what they can do is to sort of assess the overall shape of a neuron, where it forms its connections, where it's sending out various projections to. Basically what you do is you inject a particular dye. Sometimes it's attached to like a rabies virus or something. Sometimes it's not, into the target cell, and then it will be transported backwards up sort of upstream, and you can learn about sort of the nature of the connectivity between various neurons. Let me see. Yeah, I'm not sure they could attribute the alterations of the ultrasonic vocalizations in mice directly to differences in motor output, but they did observe a difference in morphology of the laryngeal motor neurons, and also related to FOXP2 expression in the neurons that are just upstream of those motor neurons, presumably the ones that are providing instructions to how the motor neuron should fire and activate the larynx. So yeah, I don't think they can necessarily disentangle like whether the USVs, the ultrasonic vocalizations, were a consequence of that, but like, yeah, I think they were mostly trying to focus on sort of the differential outcomes of the mutation itself, as opposed to the interaction of different consequences of the mutation.
Okay. So is that just a normal thing for, rather than it being a specific set of things like motor control in one box and something else in one box, and then genes controlling for each of those things being regulated by higher genes? Does it tend to be more interwoven than that? Like with FOXP2 controlling things in all different kind of areas, it tends to be just things tied around each other. And
yes, it's hierarchical. It also sometimes it can be cyclical. So yeah, it is enormously complicated in both of those directions.
Okay.
So oftentimes so that's one sort of view of sort of genetics and speech production, where we look at mutations that in genes that produce specific language impairments, like the example of this particular FOXP2 mutation. But you can also look at the question the other way around. There are certain psychiatric conditions that we normally think of as thought disorders or mood disorders that actually also produce impairments in speech. And that's just another way of viewing the interrelatedness between these different processes in the brain, with language and speech production and speech interpretation on one side, and then internal thought construction on the other. They're actually highly interwoven. They probably have various subroutines within those processes that are used in both internal thought and also with speech. And one example of this is schizophrenia, and there is a particular mutation that is very heritable in a gene called DISC1, which stands for discovered in schizophrenia 1, that has been very well characterized. And interestingly enough, DISC1 is a downstream target of FOXP2 in humans. So basically FOXP2 since it's a gene that controls whether or not other genes are turned on or off, DISC1 happens to be one of those targets. And there have been a few papers where people have tried to understand the effect of the KE family mutation of FOXP2 on whether or not DISC1 is turned on and off or off. And they found that when they introduced the mutation to FOXP2, it was not able to turn off the expression of DISC1 as well as the more common variants in the human population. So while that would mean that change in direction is opposite of what we would expect necessarily for if you wanted to test the hypothesis that the FOXP2 family mutation specific language impairment could be recapitulated by mutations in DISC1 that are observed in people with schizophrenia. We don't necessarily expect the effects of the FOXP2 mutation to be like completely encompassing the mutations or the consequences of mutations to disc 1 per se. But what it does show is that because these two genes are in the same regulatory pathway, that disrupting one or the other will affect speech. They might affect speech in different ways, but things that we normally think of as being thought disorders don't necessarily, also have a lot of other components to them as well. And speech is one of them. And I believe in individuals with schizophrenia, they generally have more difficulty with like clausal embedding, which is not necessarily, I think, a feature of people with the FOXP2 related specific language impairment. Autism spectrum disorders are another good example of this. So there's a gene that has been identified as being involved in specific cases of individuals with autism called MET. And it is also a downstream target of FOXP2.
Right.
And individuals with mutations in this gene, I believe, also have issues with clausal embedding in their speech. But the idea is that, like, you can't necessarily break one thing, genetically speaking, without affecting a bunch of other stuff. And so I think a lot of the way that we categorize different types of language impairments might have been just based on what the most salient feature was at the time it was discovered,
right,
as opposed to, actually being encompassing of all of the consequences of that particular mutation or genetic aberration or whatnot.
So does that kind of highlight that maybe asking whether language evolved as a way of thinking or as a way of communicating might just be a question that's, the reality is so complicated that the question is not even meaningful? Like,
I think that the question is certainly still quite meaningful. It is very complicated that with the tools that we have at present, super difficult to investigate. I know that there are people out there who subscribe to sort of the more Chomsky ideas about universal grammar and the single step model, where in relatively recently in human evolution, there's been a single mutation that has been introduced into the human population. This conferred the faculties of language, and that mutation became fixed in the modern human population. This is a very, very stringent, like, narrow view of some of the arguments that Chomsky has made, but some of these individuals also think that this process evolved mostly to organize internal thought as opposed to communication socially, I think it's possible to achieve both of those things with such mutations. Although whether or not it was one or several is an interesting area of debate, and how those things might have arisen and become essentially ubiquitous in the human population is an active area of investigation.
Do you think it's kind of making a comment on I suppose, as well as the kind of underlying genetic situation being more complicated, the kind of network of causality in terms of what drives mutations a certain way is also extremely complicated, isn't it? So as you say, like, there's no reason why selective pressure couldn't have simultaneously driven a certain way of thinking and a certain way of communicating. If those two things arose from the same underlying thing, then to say that it was driven by a need to think in a certain way or driven by a need to communicate in a certain way is, there's no reason why it couldn't be, like you say, both, because causal factors are so complicated and so difficult to unpick. And now, since we've been talking about genetics and I've learned a tiny bit more about that, I've realized that it's even more complicated than I thought it was initially, which I mean, I thought it was fairly complicated, but yeah, with things being so interlinked, any comment on causality is going to be kind of reductive anyway, I think, isn't it?
I think sort of the general strategy that geneticists take when investigating causality is not necessarily finding one thing that is necessary and sufficient for a particular phenomenon like language, but looking for causes that explain a certain percentage of the phenomenon that you're investigating, because it is very, very rare that you can have one singular thing that is causing a particular biological phenomenon. Moreover, we also have to consider not just what the biological substrate we're working with, like what genes are in the gene pool, like what kinds of faculties already are existing in a population of organisms that you're observing, but we also have to consider the selective pressures that are on them. In the case of language, social interaction is a huge selective pressure. Humans didn't evolve in a vacuum. We evolved as a social species. So being able to communicate efficiently would be an advantage. To communicate efficiently, you might want to organize your thoughts a little bit better, right? Yeah. So it kind of makes sense that like both of these systems would be affected, especially if they're using similar regions of the brain, executing similar subroutines of various programs in the brain. But yeah.
Lecturer sort of recommended as a paper, which I think I talked about briefly in one of the UG videos, or one of the origin language videos, and it was methodologically a bit dodgy, which I think I went into. But the kind of overall premise of it was that one causal factor might have been the need to simultaneously maintain and keep track of relationships with lots of people. So for one thing, you have to know, well, you don't have to know every single thing about everyone's lives, but if you have, say, 120 relationships that you have to keep track of, it's a social necessity that you keep track of them, then that's going to require you to think in a certain way, to think about, for example, what people are doing when you're not there, what people were doing in the past and stuff like that. And it's also going to require you to be able to kind of interact with more than one person at once, and to communicate about things which aren't happening in the immediate vicinity and stuff like that, which I thought, even though the method was a bit dodgy, it was a very interesting, I'll reference it on screen, it was a very interesting look at the whole causality thing, because, as you say, lots of factors can be sort of intertwined, and also because genes themselves are so interwoven in terms of what effects they have, I suppose not only does something have to have selective pressure, well, I mean, things can happen by genetic drift, but not only does a selective pressure have an effect on a gene, but it also, a change to that gene has to kind of be permissible. So it might do one thing that's beneficial, it might do one thing that's a bit unbeneficial, it might do a load of things that don't really have any effect, but they require you to divert more energy to things that you don't really need to divert more energy to, or resources or something like that. So it has to be sort of permissible in order to catch on as well, I would think, but maybe that's not.
Yeah, the mutation can't be so deleterious that it causes other problems, right? But oftentimes when talking about evolutionary biology, we hold these two simultaneous kind of dissonant views, where we talk about this thing is so exquisitely adapted to this one particular thing, but if you zoom out and look at all of the attributes of an organism, how it might be affected or operating in its environment, then you think, well, maybe this is just good enough.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, like both of these things seem to be true at the same time. So for example, organizing internal thought would be something that is very metabolically taxing for an individual organism that is not using it to interact socially and to be able to improve its fitness and survival. Brains are very expensive pieces of hardware to run. They consume a lot of calories. If you had like an individual human that had this particular feature and could not share it with its compatriots or like the other humans that are living in that person's group, it might pose more of a cost in some ways than it would be an advantage. So it's kind of interesting to think about the single step theory of the evolution of human language, because if you had just like one genius human who managed to acquire a lucky mutation that allowed them to vastly improve their ability to organize internal thought, would they be actually able to act on that in a social context to help improve their fitness of survival, or would it just end up being more of a tax on the individual?
Another thing, like reliance, sorry.
There was a paper that was published sometime last year where they used different types of mathematical modeling. They used the diffusion model to try to assess the probability of whether or not a mutation like that in a single individual that posed a very, very large fitness advantage for language could become fixed in a population, or if the accumulation of like 1 or 2 dozen moderately like good mutations could achieve is more likely for something like the evolution of language. And they concluded that just a handful of like moderately good mutations is probably more likely and would be able to become fixed in a population I think more quickly than a single extremely good mutation arising in one individual.
Another thing is like the fact that we kind of rely on language at this point. I don't know if Chomsky's original idea was that it was within one generation, or that it was literally one change. But I mean, I think that's how I've always read it. But if that change also came with the social reliance on language that we now have, then that individual would definitely not be in a good position, because they would have this requirement to interact with people using language, and no one else would be able to reciprocate it. So you'd think that would, if modern people who don't acquire language fully or anything to go by, that would probably pose a real problem. Although,
yeah, a much more easy to imagine scenario. This is very speculative, and there's not direct proof or evidence of this being the case. But the more plausible scenario seems to be, well, people have some faculty of communication with each other. Maybe it's not terribly systematic or organized, but you have a few individuals in the population who are maybe just better at doing something like that, and kind of can get the group to have better cohesion and sort of catalyze that, and that presents as a fitness advantage to the entire group. You don't have to be amazingly better than your competitors, you just have to be just better than your competitors, right?
That's fair enough.
So that seems to be the more plausible scenario, and based on some of this modeling, that would support something like that. But yeah, there is this kind of standoff between selective pressure and like things that are biologically driven, but they don't work in absence of each other. And so it's kind of a funny parallel to the universal grammar debate amongst linguists, where you have your Chomsky fans who believe that there is some universal grammar. It is, to some extent, it's hard-coded. kind of thing, versus the Everett's fans who think that a lot of what is present in language is determined culturally. And the thing is, like, to a certain extent, both of them are true, but in their extreme versions of their interpretations, they're probably wrong.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in the middle.
I don't know where. I actually had a little look to try and see where Chomsky's recent work puts him in the debate, because I tend to sort of assume he doesn't still necessarily think the one single mutation thing, and I couldn't personally find any examples of him going back on it. I just know he's kind of dived more into the merge thing recently, but he is.
Yeah, actually, the people that I was talking about, the modeling one, they talk about the plausibility of a single mutation being allowing you to do merge.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, that would be something to add to the sort of citation list.
Yeah, hang on, I'll note that down. Actually, if I go back through it afterwards, then I'll note down everything that needs kind of citing. But yeah, if that's the case, I don't really see why. It might just be because I've not read the original arguments thoroughly enough, but I don't see why the whole single step thing is actually necessary to suggest that there might be what Chomsky's suggesting, there might be rigid things in place. Surely that kind of thing could arise theoretically in a step-by-step gradual kind of way.
Yeah, I'm not sure entirely what the motivation is, if that's more of like he's making that argument sort of based on anthropological data, or like just comparing modern humans to other modern primate species, because like a lot of the information that we had about the genetics of ancient hominins was not available at the time that these ideas were formulated. So
yeah,
I don't have that expertise in that arena, so I would not be able to answer that question. But as far as like an evolutionary biologist's point of view goes, I don't think that there's necessarily a reason to believe one way or the other, aside from the fact that those macro level mutations where there's a huge fitness advantage that's conferred by a single mutation, those are very, very, very rare. And instead, small tweaks that pose moderate advantages seem to be more plausible as far as like some of these modeling things go.
I suppose maybe, do you think that the kind of in order for something like language to appear suddenly in one mutation, that mutation would have to be in a gene that governed lots and lots and lots and lots of other things, wouldn't it? And the number of things that could go wrong with that would massively offset, like that's bound to, that's going to change a lot of other things outwardly, probably, isn't it?
Yeah, so for it to show up in one individual in a single step like that, it would have to be, well, this is all me speculating. I have no evidence for this. This is more of just based on my knowledge of how evolution works. It would have to be in a gene that would be involved in a bunch of different types of processes in the brain. And yes, the potential for secondary downstream consequences that pose a fitness disadvantage for other things is very high. Yeah, so yeah, the idea that you can have moderate advantages sort of accumulating over a few generations in several individuals, and that becoming fixed in the population seems to be more likely. And also you can think about the problem sort of in the opposite direction too. And Charles Darwin, I believe, wrote about this fairly extensively, this concept fairly extensively in The Origin of Species, where I believe, if memory serves me correctly, Charles Darwin was troubled by the evolution of something like the eye, because it seemed like such a complicated structure. It does very specific things for an organism. How could something like that eventually show up? And the answer is that it gets built up in very, very small steps. Nature tinkers with things that it already has to build more complicated things. So for example, you might want to start out with genes that encode proteins that are sensitive to light, and will change a cell's response depending on whether or not that protein absorbs a photon or it does not. So just having molecules that are present in cells that are sensitive to light is probably step one. Then you might want to have that manifest in a group of cells and change how they interact. And then you can then move on to things like forming an image once you've sort of gotten the basics of just being able to detect light at all. So the idea would be that you'd be building up complicated systems gradually over time, by making small adjustments. Some of them will be deleterious, and some of them will be deleterious enough that they get lost to the modern gene pool. Some of them will pose moderate advantages, but it all eventually kind of led up to an eye that can form images, has these really complicated process of being able to detect different colors, being able to detect edges and things like that. So language seems like a complicated process to me. Yeah. And it probably started with like much more simpler forms, what we call simpler forms of communication being modified into more complicated structures. Yeah. Both behaviorally and also at the neural level.
So in terms of the Everett side of the debate, the idea that a lot of features of language are more culturally dictated than genetically dictated. Do you think this kind of allows room for that? Or do you think that's a bit, I mean, obviously as you said, either extreme is going to be probably not factually accurate, but does it allow for any room for culture to kind of have an effect on things beyond just what order adjectives and nouns go in and things like that?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time talking about the Ding-et-al paper as you know, like there are aspects of language that have to conform to the way our brains operate, and that's very in line with sort of like a biologically focused view of language, but it's also very much a social phenomenon, and because humans are social species, we need to be able to have culture, and the way that we interact with each other also influence language, and also have room in the brain to be able to accommodate things like that. And so I think an interesting interpretation of the Gallant Lab papers with the semantic map of the brain is interesting. Is that there are certain semantic categories that are highly overlapping in individuals or between individuals and seem to be fairly consistent, but there's still plenty of room for variation. And this could be the space upon which culture could be operating, where if we have like 2/3 roughly of the semantic map of the brain being something where experience, culture can be sort of fine-tuning things, modifying things, and especially like those representations aren't necessarily static. They can be modified with experience. That's sort of the realm within culture can operate. So clearly there are some things that seem to be maybe not biologically hard-coded, but there's a bias in the patterning for certain semantic representations to elicit particular patterns of activity in the brain, and that seems to be consistent across individuals. There's plenty of room for things to be modified.
Like the root of, and this again, this is not necessarily a question, more just a kind of an observation. I think the root of the controversy around Everett's claims about Pirahara and things like that are, it's clear that something like subject, verb, object, word order, or something like that is cultural in the sense that it's learnt and different groups of people do it differently because of the way they've learnt it. But I suppose it's the connection between that and other aspects of culture. So he talks about this immediacy of experience principle and how that might affect certain aspects of the language. And I suppose it's whether there is a kind of hard line between aspects of language which are cultural only in as much as they're just linguistic features that are learned, you know, or how that kind of ties into other aspects of culture, like whether you think much about things you haven't personally experienced or stuff like that. So I suppose that's just a random observation. But anyway, thank you very much indeed for joining us and for doing a monumental amount of paper combining and researching and things like that. And yeah, thank you for.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be able to share sort of the wonder of neuroscience with other people who are interested in learning it. Yeah,
I think it's really accessible kind of entry point to anyone else who's looking to sort of research it further. Thank you very much indeed.